Who am I?
Richard Kazimer, media veteran.
Why I got in radio is because I'm good with a knife.
Contributor in Perth, Australia.
Our friend Richard Kazimer in the United States.
How are you guys enjoying the 19th century? Is that working out for you? How can you say, I'm not making fun of you as a race, I'm making fun of you as black performers?
I think as a country, Americans are as patriotic as the most rabid UK football hooligan.
Who am I?
Richard S. Kazimer. As the theme music says, have we set him Mission Impossible? Well, at least there isn't the, well, it's your job if you choose to accept it, all that kind of stuff. Morning, Richard S. Kazimer.
Good morning, sir. How are you?
Oh, we're doing extremely well. By the way, if you'd like to be this man's friend on Facebook, that is how you find him at Richard S. Kazimer, Kazimer. Nobody is even going to bother to ask what the S stands for, because sometimes it can stand for absolutely nothing, or sometimes it stands for one of those names that nobody, even when they get to their adult life, is prepared to admit.
If you want to find out, listeners can also access all past Hot Topics segments in my Facebook video folder without any friending obligation whatsoever. It's a virtual Hot Topics jukebox on demand, and I'll even tell you what the S stands for.
Oh, right, okay. Other big question, I suppose, and the answer has got to be yes. Do you play requests?
Absolutely.
That's the main thing. Hey, mate, something that's come up has very much come into focus in more recent times. I think, look, we've seen all sorts of things, car recalls, people buying clothes and the buttons fall off and all that sort of stuff, food not packaged properly, and it's about the quality of workmanship. And I suppose we could ask, it's a question that we ask here. I've got no doubt it's a question you ask in the United States. The issue of outsourcing to countries like China, the subcontinent in our case, and probably places like China, and I guess more so Mexico in your particular case. It's all about being very, very price conscious, being able to get things at a lower price. Price-wise, it's cheaper for the owner, but one would wonder if it's worth the reputation of companies sometimes. I mean, with some of the quality of workmanship issues, as we outsource more, as we become more automated and more mechanised, is there an argument to say that in some instances quality is being sacrificed on the altar of all these wonderful changes that we're supposedly seeing?
I don't really think so, to be honest with you. This is a case of mechanization versus handmade materials. There probably isn't much in our daily lives that we don't use or even eat that hasn't been touched, processed, or developed and even manufactured by some form of mechanization. It's been that way for hundreds of years. It creates easier, faster, safer, more efficient ways of producing the things that we use all the time. That's always been the goal of the inventors and the engineers for thousands of years, is to get things out there, get them mass-produced, and get them to the public as quickly as possible. Now, whether or not the mechanization of the person, of the people that are doing it, that quality varies, but that's also the management's fault and not necessarily that of the machine.
In your opinion, and has there been suggestions, certainly in your country, that the drive, say for example, to outsource to countries where you've got cheaper labour sources, because of course those jobs that require intensive labour are the jobs that have been outsourced simply because the labour costs are cheaper. That, in your case, I guess means places like China and Mexico. Have there been criticisms about, aside from the obvious criticisms about these people are taking American jobs, and I mean, in the case here, you just simply take out American and substitute it with Australian, the argument becomes exactly the same. Apart from that argument, has there been criticisms of the quality of the products that come from countries like that? And in your view, according to the evidence, do you believe that those criticisms are genuinely justified?
Yes. Now, there's a couple of issues here that we need to deal with. That the companies that are outsourcing our jobs overseas are predominantly American companies. And the reason that they are able to do this is that they have been given tax breaks, and with deregulation allows them to actually do that. Our manufacturing jobs, for the most part, have gone overseas. The overseas contractors or subcontractors are sometimes owned outright by the American business owner, or it is subcontracted to that business owner. The difference between if that same product was made here in mass production or a mechanized environment would be any better, probably yes, because we have far more quality control over here than can be observed or maintained overseas for pennies on the dollar. So you're absolutely correct. That is a huge issue, but we have no recourse until Congress and the Senate and laws are enacted that penalize American companies for sending our jobs overseas. and having shoddy products come back to us that we pay for and really virtually get no return on.
Yeah, that seems to be interesting because the part, I guess the part about outsourcing the job, I guess the argument there would come down to companies making commercial decisions. I think where the argument really starts to hold some water is if you say, well, okay, the product you're getting back is an inferior product, surely there would be a requirement to maintain the standard.
Absolutely, but the other side of that is the business dollars and cents side of it is that in a mass-produced mechanization scenario, and I'll use an example that's happening right now as we speak. Fisher-Price, the huge toy manufacturer, has just had a recall of children's riding toys that are made in China. These toys are being sold here in the United States. 11 million of these toys are being recalled. Those toys are going to be recalled. They're going to be remanufactured, replaced in a fraction of a time if there were more hands-on people making these things. So the end result is they bite the bullet, they take a hit, but they can mass-produce these things again without that defect. So there is that upside in mass production is that even though you're putting out an inferior product, you can change it in a heartbeat and replace it on the market in the blink of an eye.
And of course that's an option that would not be available to you were you manufacturing locally, simply because the unit cost would be far too high to do it.
It remains to be seen. Give us the chance. That's the problem. We could do the same thing here. Of course, our cost would be different than, let's say, whatever the hourly wage is or the per-piece wage is in country XYZ. So I think that really doesn't hold water. It does from a business sense that if a business owner can get that product made in a fraction of a time, less cost, good for them. But to compare that with the American dollar and the American economy really isn't fair, except if you're a business owner.
Or a consumer, because of course consumers are buying things, and I would imagine that the same applies in your country as applies here. And I've often put this argument forward, and that is the most sensitive part of the consumer is the hip pocket. The reason why, for example, they will take a cheaper, inferior product that might be built in an emerging economy like a China or a Mexico is simply because it is cheaper. That is the key driving component.
This is true, but Americans will buy a superior product and pay a premium price for it if it is indeed a superior product. However, if our manufacturing jobs do return to this country and we start producing the things that we buy and consume and use, those prices of those items are going to level off. Granted, they may be a few cents, a few dollars higher than what we're used to, but it's going to put more people back to work. Therefore, the price of that item is going to reflect what the economy can bear, and everything balances out. But just give us a chance is all the unions and the American worker are asking.
I would imagine the scenario is going to be exactly the same there as it is here, and probably in many other parts. I mean, there are certainly parts of Europe where it also holds true. I would imagine that back to the future is not going to be an option. Look, I suppose when we talk about manufacturing, it's also interesting. Something that has featured prominently in more recent times in the United States particularly, and we've been hearing about this, has been recalls on cars, including cars like Toyota, which by their very nature have a reputation for being a fairly high quality product. I mean, they've had enough recalls on Toyotas in the United States that as a brand, the company itself must be quite concerned about the image that it's developed in the United States. Why has this been happening, one would ask?
It goes right back to poor management decisions where you're trying to cut costs. Again, I'm going to stand up for the machinery, the mechanism itself, that a mechanism is not a bad thing. Producing a quality product in a safer, more efficient environment is what it's all about, and that goes back to Archimedes' time. However, if management decides to cut corners and program the machines to do things at a faster rate, a lighter touch in its weld, for example, that product is going to be subpar. And that's why you see it's never just one recall. It's always something is recalled, and then another piece that goes with that is then recalled, and it's a domino effect. But it all boils down to the person who is making the decisions to program those machines to compromise themselves. Now, an example, again, it goes back to the recent BP Gulf oil disaster, was caused by management cutting corners by pumping seawater into the mechanism to prevent the blowout instead of having this expensive mud that they would use that shipped in from the shore. Now, the mechanism worked fine until it was compromised. Mechanisms work fine in car manufacturing until they are told to do something that is less than a quality standard.
The point there, I suppose, also comes back to adequate regulation to say, okay, well, there is a minimum standard, and you may not go below that minimum standard. It strikes me that something that is going to have to take place, especially when it comes to manufacturing, and also perhaps arguably, because you talked about the Gulf oil disaster as well, also arguably some of the operational practices that seem to be in foot. At some point, I think somewhere along the line, we're actually going to have regulation that says, okay, we accept that businesses want to be efficient, we accept that businesses want to keep their costs as low as possible, but somebody has to accept that there is actually a bottom limit.
That's a good point, and the issue is, and here we go again, Richard's going to talk politics, is that we have regulators in place, and this applies to the food industry, the mining industry, the car industry, the environment. We've seen it all happen time and again. In just the span that you and I have been doing these segments, this country has been hit with some major problems, foodborne illnesses, oil spills, mining disasters, where these industries should have been regulated by government agencies. The Bush administration has gutted all of these agencies in thinking that, and also deregulating the industries from any sort of recourse or accountability, because the Republican Party feels that the people who know better how to regulate their industry are the people within the industry who are also creating the violations. So that is the problem that we have in the United States, is that we don't have a big brother type government that swoops down and monitors everything and then drops the iron fist when you start to do things on the cheap, considering how many businesses we still have in this country and how few agencies we have that are employed by people to go out into this 3,000-mile wide 50-state country and monitor this stuff. It just doesn't happen.
Bearing in mind the administration of which you're most critical hasn't been in office for 2 years, what's the current administration done to change that?
Not enough. That's a good point. It's a valid point, and not enough. We have seen somewhat of a turnaround because of the BP oil disaster.
But that was tombstone engineering. I mean, there's no question. The response to BP was tombstone engineering. The response came after it happened.
Exactly. The problem that we have here in our form of government is that when a new administration takes over, they don't arbitrarily clean house in every single agency. So it's not unusual for, let's say, the agency that monitors mining. That agency would stay in place from administration to administration because it is so huge and so cumbersome that it changes its staff due to attrition and not necessarily any new administration coming in and cleaning house, because we have so many agencies within our federal government that unfortunately do so little to protect us that it's not unusual for these agencies to continue doing nothing or turning a blind eye to all the problems that we have in this country. And I don't know what the answer is. The answer might be a government such as you have in Australia. What do you think?
I don't know about that. I mean, I've got to say, don't worry, the sort of governments and the way we have them, there are certainly many aspects to that need looking at. I've often thought that if we ended up with a really good hybrid between the two, we'd probably get somewhere close. But of course, the big argument, I suppose, is the old balancing act, isn't it? It's between having enough regulation to ensure that people do the right thing, but not too much regulation that you become overly restrictive. And the key is finding the balance between the two. Sometimes I suspect it's probably fair to say that that's easier said than done. But, the old line, when I first was looking at this, talking about workmanship, one of the first things that came to my mind was a number of people who said to me, oh, they don't make them like they used to. Now, in some instances, it's probably just as well, because the way they used to make things was probably pretty horrendous in some particular instances. But in most cases, it comes back to people talking about the fact that the workmanship just doesn't seem to be there. It's like the people who build them don't seem to care about the quality of their product like they once used to, even though these days they've got more technology and more knowledge to actually make their products far better.
One of my many incarnations, one of my first jobs was working in a shoe factory, and it employed hundreds of people that made women's shoes from scratch. The parts were cut from leather using metal dies and these huge machines that had like dinosaur heads on them that came down like cookie cutters and cut the leather parts. Soles, heels, all the interior parts were made right there on the premises, and all the parts were hand-stitched with sewing machines and then glued together, boxed, and shipped to retailers all over the country. Now, all of that went away. All of that went overseas, and looking at those shoes today, they are far inferior quality than they were many years ago working in this American shoe factory. We still make things by hand. We still make a lot of furniture over here. The Martin Guitar Company in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, one of the finest guitars in the world, There's nothing better than taking the tip of your finger and seamlessly going over that entire body on a D45 guitar. I mean, there's nothing like it. And it's still made here, primarily all handmade here in the United States. Also, nothing like a fresh deli pastrami sandwich, too, that's put together by somebody's hand. So we still make a few things by hand over here.
Yeah. Do you think at some point anyone's ever going to issue, and anyone's ever really going to take on the challenge of quality control and quality of workmanship? I mean, sometimes you look at things and you think to yourself, this is just a piece of shoddy rubbish. I mean, at some point, is somebody actually ever going to invoke a standard where you say, you know something? Before you can sell this type of product, for example, whatever it is, you must meet a minimum standard. And that minimum standard can never be compromised.
The barometer of that is whether or not the consumer buys it.
Oh, of course, that's always going to be the case.
Yes.
And this gets back to what I was talking about earlier when I made mention about the fact that I'm absolutely 100% convinced that the most sensitive part of the consumer is the hip pocket, and that consumers will often be prepared to accept an inferior product, at least at the time of purchase, because they believe they're saving money. Even though, look, I think sometimes we could present quite a valid argument to show that it's a false economy. In the short term, the consumer does believe they're getting a better deal.
In an ideal world, hopefully, fingers crossed, that we will get to a point in our lives, in this country at least, where the American worker says, give me a chance, let's open these factories, let's produce something that is unique to us, and we'll make the effort. We'll make it a quality that is substandard to none. If there comes a time, I hope that it does happen. There's absolutely nothing that's holding us back.
You know what my prediction is? I think both our countries have long since moved past that. We've moved into other areas, and the key is to say, okay, we look at where we're going in the future, because I don't think that, especially when you look at emerging economies and what have you, I don't think we will ever be able to compete with companies like that. And I mean, I know that's happened here, and we've seen factories close, and they've simply said, well, we cannot compete with those people who've decided to already outsource their manufacturer overseas. So therefore, what we're seeing is the fact that people are not prepared to pay the extra couple of dollars for a T-shirt to have made in Australia, or in your case, made in America on it.
There's a big difference between we can't compete and we won't compete. Not even making an effort has been a problem here for many generations. And I think that we've been browbeat and have been told by our own business leaders that, oh no, the reason I have to go overseas is because the American worker can't possibly do this and you charge too much. And yet we've got 17 million illegal immigrants, predominantly from Mexico and south of the border, that are coming here that are doing all the work for us because we don't want to do the jobs. So we need to get our priorities straight and get ourselves back on the right track in order for this to happen. I do believe it can happen. I know it can happen in Australia. The technology that you folks have in WA is second to none. I'm so impressed with what's going on there as far as technology is concerned, and there's absolutely no reason why WA and America can't again be world leaders in new innovative technology. All
right. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Richard. By the way, if you'd like to be Richard's friend on Facebook, Richard S. Kazimer, Kazimer is how you spell the surname. As always, my friend, a pleasure. We shall have a chat again next week.
All right, brother. Go Pies.